Hello and welcome to the AI Journal podcast. I'm Tom Allen, the founder of the AI Journal, and today we have the fantastic Stephen Kavey joining us from Ground Labs. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Tom, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Brilliant to have you here. And I'd like to start off with asking if you can please give us an intro to who you are, where you're from, and a couple of things that you love doing.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tom, again for having me. My name is Steve Kavey. I'm actually one of the co-founders here at Ground Labs and our chief evangelist. I'm Australian by background. I've been living in Singapore for the last 10 years, and I've been in the data security space for the last 20. Originally a technical guy, network engineer by background, coming from the electronic payment space, having to keep millions of transactions and billions of dollars secure. And through that journey, I became very familiar with security standards and compliance. And that eventually led to Ground Labs becoming an idea that my co-founder and I came up with. And we started that journey about 13 years ago. And we've been on it ever since. Today, Ground Labs is a global company spanning Sydney, Singapore, Dublin, Austin, Texas. We're people around the world, and we sell into enterprise clients, helping them to find and secure personal and sensitive and critical data wherever it's hiding, whether it's in unstructured or structured data sources. Ultimately, that's what we're finding is driving a lot of the data breaches and a lot of the reasons why people are struggling to comply with all these new security and data privacy laws that are around the world.
So it's interesting you touched on it, because when we had our last discussion, Stephen, we're looking at all the work you do and the great stories you were painting about how you can help customers. So I'd love to know, what was the origin story at Ground Labs? You touched on it briefly there with your awesome background, but are there any notable highlights to how you got to the business to where it is today, Stephen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good when you have an industry background in something, because you get to see the problems firsthand. And I guess my journey really started in payments in the late 90s, and before that I ran a small ISP as well. So I've been really on this internet wave that happened since the mid 90s, and I've seen security evolve. I've seen that period of time where just by virtue of having a Windows computer dialed into the internet with a modem, you suddenly expose the contents of your C drive if you have a local network sharing turned on, and then that turned into all sorts of fascinating attacks where you could blue screen of death someone's computer just by sending a simple packet at port 139 via their modem connected, and all sorts of other fun things that went on around that time. And that, obviously security over time started to become a lot more important. Suddenly every business was connected to the internet. Suddenly businesses started realizing you needed to have a firewall, otherwise you were going to fall victim to some sort of an attack. And I guess that led into my journey in payments, where e-commerce, the e-commerce boom was happening around the 2000s. Suddenly everybody wanted to accept orders in real time. Before that, it was an insecure form. You entered your details, including your credit card number. It would turn into an email, and then someone would manually key in those details in order to process the order. And then your personal details and your credit card information would live in someone's mail account and on their computer forevermore, and probably on a web server as well that would inevitably be compromised at some point. So we had all these interesting security problems going on for a very long time there. And it was, as many of you have been on this journey yourselves in the world of PCI, around that 2006 period was when all the brands got together and said, enough's enough. We're really starting to see a massive rise in credit card fraud. And so we need to provide a single security standard for the world to abide by. And hence the PCI Council was born. And I was in the middle of payments during that time. I was one of the first people in Australia to be assessed under those standards. And so I became very familiar with it. And then I started finding myself becoming an advisor to many of our customers, very large merchants, auction websites, classifieds websites, and so on, that were doing very large volumes of credit card transactions online. And they were being told by Visa and the other brands that if you can't comply with these new standards, we're going to shut down your ability to process credit cards. And so, as you can imagine, suddenly security and compliance became of great importance. And so through that journey, I learned about this fascinating problem that I just couldn't believe hadn't really been solved properly. And that was the problem of storing credit card information anywhere. I saw it happening within the organization I was working for, system administrators taking dumps from databases, emailing files around, even to the point where there was an employee who was actually caught sending files full of people's information to a customer because it was they were supposed to do it, or that the customer had an entitled reason to see that information, but they were sending it through an insecure email. And the day we stepped in and said, "Well, you need to stop doing that now. This is about security, and we have these standards to comply with. There are alternative ways to get information to a customer, including perhaps through a secure website download and other methods." But the customers were insisting, "No, we don't want to break our process. You must continue to send those emails to us." And so we had people in our organization, one in particular, who we found was sending that information via their personal Hotmail account, just to circumvent these attempts to put some sort of control and security in place. Just as again, all of us who have been in the space for a while can attest to the fact that employees, people, are often your biggest challenge when trying to implement security.
Well, if employees are our biggest challenge, then how important is it to do data discovery? Because what you're describing there sounds like a whole lot of stuff going on that nobody knows anything about. And that could be one massive weak link in an organization.
During that time, it was interesting because it's hard to sell someone on an idea that they need to do something if they can't see the problem, and that was, I think, a reason why data discovery was very slow to be adopted during that period. Certainly, anyone that had to comply with the security standard, they were being advised by security assessors, auditors, and so on, and so we became very successful by partnering up with many of the auditors out there in the world who were a trusted advisor to these organizations. And so they would tell these organizations, "Look, you probably have hidden data lying around the organization, whether it's sitting in emails, whether it's sitting in files, or in your big CRM database or your application database and so on. And you don't know it's there because it's probably been getting in there via some process that you were unaware of. And the only way you're going to find out about it is if you actually use some technology, some data discovery technology." So we came out with our very first tool back then that was very focused on PCI data. And it was an immediate success. Every security assessor in the world was talking about it, and the word spread organically, which we we're very proud of. And it wasn't very long, by about 2010, 2011, that we started to see enterprise customers coming forward saying, "Well, we've just worked with one of the auditors that you guys know, and that they showed us just on one or two or three machines that we have some problems. We have 3,000 machines, or we have 30,000 machines. Can you help us figure that problem out?" And so that led to a new challenge. We had to go start designing a piece of software that could be distributed across a large number of systems and then do data discovery everywhere, and really uncover those hidden problems, looking inside all the hidden pieces of a system. And you'd be surprised how many interesting places hidden data can reside. Again, if you don't know it's there, and it's not until you truly go and look at it that you start to uncover some very interesting truths about what's happening in the organization.
But people assume they know where the data is. If I'm a
They
CFO
do.
or CEO, I'm going, yes, I have an ERP system. Yes, I have a central database. But what you're describing there sounds like data is absolutely everywhere. Is it true we know where it actually is? Then do we know where data is in an organization?
So we commonly run surveys on different webinars and through other sources. The common, when we ask the audience, "Do you think your organization knows where all of its data is?" About 70% will respond and say, "No, we actually don't think our organization knows where all the data is." And so that leaves that balance of 30%. And we would even question, of those 30%, how did you come to that conclusion? What evidence did you have to back that position up to say we actually know where all of our data is? And so what we often find when we dig deep enough is that the traditional way to understand this problem was to do some sort of a data mapping diagram. You'd run around the organization, you'd ask every department, "Are you storing data? Are you storing data about customers or employees? Where are you storing it? How are you collecting it? And what are you doing with it?" And you get all sorts of answers, and you get lots of great information back. And then you'd put all of this together in some sort of a map and draw a really big diagram, and then you would present that to the business. And what's really interesting is that that is information that is effectively being pulled together through assumption. A lot of these departments that you're asking are assuming that this is where the data is because this is what they know about. They're not telling you about the areas or the handling of data that happened in the past, or that out-of-band process that that person in the accounts team was doing. You know, they were creating their own little access database, or they had some really complicated spreadsheet that pivoted all these different data sources together to provide a consolidated view. And that data may include personal records, you know, people's names, their addresses, their date of birth, all the other things that are very sensitive. And so until you actually replace that manual process with a technology-centric data discovery process, or the way I like to explain it is you're comparing a top-down approach, you know, going and asking the business versus a bottom-up approach, which is using technology to remove all those assumptions and then just go and look at every bit of data, every byte of data that's in the organization. And what you get are hard facts. You get effectively a long list of findings that, you know, might have happened a long time ago, but they are still there today. No one was aware that that data was sitting there, and you'll learn all sorts of interesting things about the organization. Well, now you can actually build a security plan, a data security plan around properly securing that data. And chances are half the information that is found through that process can probably be deleted. That's actually the best decision a lot of organizations can do now, is to delete the data that they no longer need and no longer need to be storing because they don't have a business justified reason to do so. That customer was a customer 10 years ago, and they're probably horrified if you're still storing a full dossier of all their personal information today.
Reminds me, Stephen, because I was hearing back to what you were saying there. I heard the saying once that you have one problem with one person, have 100 people, you have 100 problems. And it goes back to all that idea of storing data. And I know I'm guilty of it as well. And you think all these data hoarders, I'd almost call them, because people, just like hoarders of a house, don't want to get rid of that data just in case. But it leads me on to the next question, because you very well pointed out in our last call, Stephen, that security was about building external parameters. And what I'm just hearing now, it makes it more susceptible to attacks. So I'd love to know what would happen if a bad guy got in or a hacker got in, and can you paint a picture for us and the audience of what this would look like?
Yeah, it's a great point, Tom. So think about how we've done security for the longest time. The focus in many security programs and the way the security budgets were being invested was very much on perimeter security. So building those walls as high and as strong as we possibly can around our business, around our networks, and around our data. And the idea is that if those walls are strong enough, then that is adequate protection. But as we've proven time and time again, there are always little holes through those walls. There are always vulnerabilities inside an organization that are being exploited. You know, tomorrow's vulnerabilities haven't been discovered yet. And this is why software vendors are constantly patching their software with new vulnerabilities that are being discovered out there in the community. And lucky we have responsible disclosure practices and many other great things where it's the industry is working together to minimize this attack surface. But there will always be vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Building a big secure network wall around your business is not the solution that's going to work anymore. Maybe a long time ago it sort of did, but it definitely doesn't anymore. And so really the idea and the principle that we speak about with many organizations is, imagine someone has already found a way into your business inside your network right now. What have you done to minimize the damage that they could do? What have you done to minimize the data that they could find and ultimately steal? And you go back not that long ago, and it was very much, how do you steal data, take it out of the network, and then go and monetize it through the black market, through an auction website or somewhere like that? That was how many of the hackers through the 2000s through to, call it 2015, they were the common types of attacks. And they're still happening now. But as many of us have seen, ransomware has taken main stage in many of the attacks. So rather than try and steal all the data, let's just leave the data where it is, figure out what's most valuable and encrypt that, and then we'll hold that to ransom, and then we'll be paid in Bitcoin. And that's one of the great things we can thank Bitcoin for, is the ability to pay anonymously and monetize things anonymously. And that has given rise to this whole ransomware problem now. So we've got two-pronged attacks now happening. Data is still being stolen, absolutely, particularly business secrets and things like that. But other forms of data, if you just simply want to monetize and hold a business to ransom, then we're using ransomware. And so I guess back to the main point, There are many ways to break into a network. There are many ways to exfiltrate data, or there are many ways just to cause chaos to an organization, regardless of how great its perimeter security might very well be. So understanding the assets that you have and understanding the risks that you have in terms of where that data is and how exposed it is, how many people can access that data, who has access, what kind of access, and what the volume of data and what the sensitivity levels are. These are all new types of visibility that organizations are wanting to have on the data. It's no longer about, well, we just have one data repository there and we have to encrypt everything. Because anyone that's done encryption before knows that encrypting absolutely everything in the business, it's a real challenge. We're partnered up with one of the world's largest encryption vendors, and they obviously want to help everybody encrypt as much as possible, but they also want, or they also are aware that there are practical limits to encrypting absolutely everything. You should encrypt the essential data, the data that has value that you don't want other people to touch or steal from you.
As consumers, we expect businesses to look after data, to encrypt it, to protect it, to delete it when they no longer need it. What you're sounding or suggesting like at the moment is that potentially self-regulation has failed. Has it failed?
I think so, to a certain extent, and this is why so many governments around the world are coming out with their own privacy and data security laws that are very focused on protecting consumers' personal data, citizens' personal data, because we've come from a place where businesses were being left to regulate themselves. And I guess here's the harsh reality. I guess it doesn't come as any surprise. Organizations, businesses prefer to work on things that generate revenue. Security traditionally has not been seen as a revenue generating initiative. It was seen as a cost center. And the other side of that problem is that it was left to the responsibility of IT. And IT were already busy. If we go back to 2020, IT were very busy trying to enable work from home and all the other wonderful things. But traditionally, IT were responsible for uptime. They were responsible for data integrity, data availability, as well as security. And as the world has evolved and the security threat has gotten far greater, we're now seeing far more specialist roles that are entirely focused on security. This is why we have the rise of the Chief Information Security Officer, the CISO. That person is a C-level executive that has responsibility over ensuring the organization's security and ensuring the data remains where it is and doesn't fall victim to a data breach. And I guess on the back of understanding your data, we're also starting to see people like the Chief Data Officer, the Chief Privacy Officer now, whose job it is to understand data and how it's used in the organization and make sure that the value of that data is maximized. And on the privacy front, understand all of these new government regulations that are coming out and understand which ones we have to comply with, which ones we don't, and then try and find the commonality across all of these different laws and regulations. So you're right, guys. It was a case of customer would give you their data. There's an inherent assumption of trust, that they just expected you to have all of the right controls in place if you're collecting their data. And unfortunately, time and time again, it's been proven that you can spend a lot of money on security, you can spend a lot of money on people, but that doesn't always equate to absolute security if you're not focusing it and investing it in the right areas. And very often organizations would miss the point if they didn't start with the data. What is it that we need to protect? Well, it's actually the data. It's, yes, the network's important, but we're really focused on the data because that's the real asset here. That's the real value. And to put in place a security program that remains aware of the data and puts all the right controls around the data puts you in a far better position to avoid a data breach.
But if we're relying on firms to put in all this security and firms are busy trying to make profit, run the organization, whatever else, then we're going to get stuck. And you mentioned a moment ago that governments are stepping in. And I think I read somewhere there's about 128 different countries with about 128 different data laws or governing laws. But are government the right people to step in? Because they don't move particularly fast normally. Technology moves on at a rate and not. So it's arguable that the government's going to be slow and maybe they don't actually understand the problem that might be transnational, trans-country, or bigger than they've ever seen. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question and a fascinating problem, Kieran. And you just have to look at each regulation. They're very much operating in isolation of all of the other regulations in the world. And the way they're written is, well, our regulation is important. So if you're doing business in our country, we don't care what other regulations you might comply with. Fundamentally, we want you to be aware of our regulation. Now, we're seeing some cooperation. We're definitely seeing data protection officers, data protection commissioners across different parts of the world working together. And the GDPR that we all have heard and know and love has something called adequacy, where they've started acknowledging the adequacy of other data security laws for the purpose of facilitating cross-border transfers of data. So rather than just simply saying, well, if you have European data in Europe, you're not allowed to transfer that anywhere, because that becomes impractical if you're a large global organization. I mean, it is a problem and it is a challenge, but at the very least, the GDPR is acknowledging the adequacy of certain data protection laws, but not others. And so what we're finding is different countries are trying to work to bolster their own data protection laws to benchmark them against the GDPR for the purpose of them being a country where you can freely move citizens' data if you're a global business. Otherwise, you have to put a lot of other controls in place.
And I have a question, Stephen, around what we were discussing on our last conversation, and it's a two-barrel question going back to what you said earlier that I'd like to pull into it. So we were speaking, and we said it's easier to be an attacker than it is a defender, and we see with especially with banks and insurance companies actually hiring hackers to hack their own systems so they know where the flaws are and where the pain points are. So I'd love to know A, why that is, but B, how do you see, and touched on it earlier quickly, with new technologies or new capabilities like blockchain and forward-thinking areas that might not even be implemented yet but are coming, how does this affect, A, the attacker having a better position, and B, what companies can do about it?
The idea or the premise is really simple. An attacker, a well-motivated attacker, typically has near unlimited resources. If they are determined to find a way into you, just time is on their side. They will keep looking at every angle, and they will learn as much about your business as possible. They will learn about every possible platform that you have, that you're running, and then they will be monitoring very closely to understand what platforms are vulnerable to what kinds of attacks. And whilst you on the defending side may have a really well-regimented security program that incorporates very frequent patch management, very frequent vulnerability management, penetration testing, as you alluded to before, which is where you pay professional white hat hackers to try and break into your network before a black hat comes along, and other different security measures to validate and test your controls. They're all good things and you need to have them in place. But a determined attacker who's just sitting there watching you every minute, every second, and trying to understand when even the smallest hole opens up, it's inevitable that they could find a way in, if they invested enough years and enough resources at the problem. This is why nation state hacking is so popular between large governments, because they have lots of resources, lots of time, and they have very specific missions and goals that they're trying to achieve. Well, on the black market, you might have very similar approaches. You might have companies. There's been a number of, I wouldn't call them fundamentalist hacks, but hacks on companies where they might have done something very unpopular or taken a very unpopular position on something, and then they become a target. There was a very popular movie making, electronic making company that we all know and love, and they were targeted on the back of a particular movie that they put out against a particular regime that existed in the world. So that there's all sorts of different scenarios where if you have time and effort and resources, you can keep attempting to break into these targets, and eventually you'll be found. But I guess the best thing you can do is, as you alluded to before, be the best defender that you can. Have people proactively attack those defenses and test your defenses through legitimate channels. And there are bug bounties now that you can put out there to say, well, if you accidentally find a vulnerability in something that we're doing out on the internet, we'll actually pay you if you disclose that to us. So rather than incentivizing the community to go to the illegal side of the world, incentivize good behavior, offer rewards and bounties for things that will make you more secure. And so this is becoming very popular in the world. But again, I think the point is that there's always going to be a way to get into your network, and the real asset that you're trying to defend is the data, irrespective of whether it's personal data, whether it's secrets, military data, depending on whether you're a government, a commercial organization, not for profit. The common issue that we're finding in the world of security is the focus on the data.
Awesome. I love it, Stephen. I feel last time we came off the call, me and Kieran were saying how much we were learning in the situations that you just don't think about, especially my background's not data and I don't understand it that well, but the things you need to consider and areas you need to consider, which brings me nicely into the question that I want to ask you around if you can share with us. So we've got a picture here of someone starting their first business. They're coming up with a new idea. They're going to market. They're getting customers. They're collecting more data. They're using more data. Can you share with us, please, and to the audience, someone doing this, what you would advice you'd give to them starting their business and why they need to consider what we've discussed today and their first kind of initial steps for collecting this data and using this data?
Absolutely. Well, so I'd even take a step back from the data first. If you're a brand new business and you're setting up your basic platforms, turn on the security controls from the beginning. One of the biggest challenges we've had as we're retrospectively going back and trying to get legacy organizations more secure is trying to deal with the habits that existed in those organizations. These are long, deep entrenched habits. And so you come along and you turn on two-factor authentication. You're going to annoy a few people. And so you've got to go through the friction of that and the training process of that. So simple things like making sure two-factor is turned on every platform that you're using, not just the main one. Implementing things like password management. Again, why is it so easy to break into an organization? Because people are using the same password everywhere. So use that password manager from day one. Every new employee is taught how to use a password manager, and they're taught the simple principle of every different platform you log in needs a completely unique, impossible to remember or guess password, and then your job is just to remember a very long phrase of words that no one could guess on you, but you can easily remember because they're just things that sit in your mind to unlock your password vault each day, and then it will populate your passwords for you, and it actually becomes so much easier. And if you can do those simple things as a baseline layer of security, you are already a huge step forward. And so then it starts coming to basic practices like encrypt files that have sensitive data in them. Be aware of sensitive data, and also put in place processes that proactively look for personal data, sensitive data, or other forms of data that are really important to you as a business as usual practice. Don't wait for a security audit, several years from now to motivate you to now worry about where did the data end up. Do it from the outset and automate it so you don't have to have full-time people worrying about that, and then have it so that it automatically alerts and tells different business owners or business stakeholders when data that they're responsible for has ended up in places that they should know about, and they should clean it up. And what you'll do is you'll create a very data aware mindset across the business. People will know that there are platforms in place that are watching the data and making sure it's only being stored in the places that it's supposed to be stored, where you have the right security controls in place. And if you put it in the wrong place, someone's going to know about it and you'll have to clean it up. So you're putting people into the right set of habits, and you do those basic things and you'll be way ahead of where most organizations are at the moment.
Love it. Simple things of getting the processes right, getting the habits right, and it's leads to success, so it becomes second nature. I love how you referred to that, because that's how we always try to think of things. So, Stephen, I've learned a lot from you today, and I've learned a lot in the last conversation as well. I'm really grateful for your time. Where can people find you? Where can they find out more about Ground Labs, the work you and the team are doing, and to get connected with you to learn more from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to connect with me personally, I'm on LinkedIn, Stephen Kavey, Cavey, but our organization is at groundlabs.com. Our main product is Enterprise Recon. It's a piece of software that will go look in your unstructured and structured data locations. So it'll look across your whole Office 365 environment, all those mailboxes and OneDrive accounts. It'll look into your desktops and your servers and across millions or billions of files that you have. And it'll look for data from 50 different countries, if you like, whether it's GDPR, whether it's the California laws and all the different laws that we didn't even get to talk about today. And frankly, it's far more fun to not talk about them, if you ask me. But out of the box, the great thing is that you can can actually deploy data discovery, and you can get up and running, in an afternoon and start looking for personal data, and then start to do things like delete or encrypt that data. And Ground Labs is online everywhere. So if you have any more questions or you want to reach out to me, I'll gladly take the call.
Awesome. And we'll put that in the show notes as well for everyone watching. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time today. Learn a lot, always great stories and ways that you're painting the picture of people. Really appreciate your time, and it's been great to have you on, sir.
Tom, Kieran, thank you very much. It was a real pleasure. I had great fun.